Mary Jane Thompson was born in 1962 to Norman Thompson and Lenore, growing up in a small town called Cheek in New York. She was the third daughter, with two more sisters joining the family later on. Mary Jane always dreamed of becoming a model, even from a young age. Despite her big dreams, she remained kind and thoughtful. After finishing high school in Cleveland, she began her journey. She lived in various big cities like California, Houston, and Los Angeles before settling in Texas. Her family remembers the last Christmas they spent together before Mary Jane moved away. She gave her sisters, Selena and Kathy, special gifts, but they didn't realize it would be their final holiday together. In 1983, at 21 years old, Mary Jane moved to Dallas, Texas, determined to make her dream of becoming a model come true. Her dreams were indeed huge, but the young girl never hesitated to work hard for them. During the 6 months of living in Dallas, Mary was working 2 jobs, full-time in a florist supply shop and part-time in a local restaurant. However, most of her income was spent on food. Went into paying for her acting and modeling classes, something she hoped would help her break into the industry. On February 11, 1984, at around 4:30 p.m., Mary Jane Thompson left her part-time job as a hostess at the restaurant near Lover's Lane and Greenway Drive. She took a bus to the Trinity Medical Clinic, located on the former Industrial Boulevard, to get a checkup for an ear infection. However, she was unable to do this as the clinic was closed. Tragically, that was the last time she was ever seen alive. 2 days later, on February 13, 1984, the authorities were called to a warehouse on the 2300 block of Irving Boulevard in the Stemmons corridor of Northwest Dallas, Texas. After a female body was discovered near the railroad tracks behind the warehouse, it was evident upon inspecting the crime scene that this was a homicide. Police quickly identified the victim as 21-year-old Mary Jane by an ID card found in a nearby gym bag. The bag contained one leg warmer, while the other was wrapped around her throat. Her pants appeared to have been cut from her body. The body bore a bite mark and numerous other bruises. The autopsy confirmed that she was sexually assaulted and then strangled to death with her own leg warmer. Unknown bodily fluids were also found on the corpse and preserved for later usage. However, this evidence wouldn't come into play for a very long time, as DNA technologies were not as advanced in the 80s as they are today. As authorities were unsuccessful in gathering further clues, the case began to turn cold. Although neither investigators nor the family lost hope despite decades passing by, there were no fresh leads to follow up on. Her family always posted her pictures and spread her story to keep her memory alive. It wasn't until 2009 any formal action could be taken in the progress of the investigation. Nearly 25 years later, in 2009, the Dallas Police Department reopened the case, and male DNA was discovered on swabs taken from Mary Jane's autopsy. But the DNA never matched a specific suspect, so the case went cold once again. In 2018, the police once again opened the cold case after Mary Jane's sister, Selena, called the investigators requesting a reinvestigation using new DNA technologies. The investigators worked with a team from the district attorney's office, while the FBI also joined the task force in 2020. In the same year, they began a thorough search on genealogical websites, using new technology like ancestry databases to identify potential relatives of the suspect based on DNA collected at the crime scene. The search narrowed down to a single suspect, 60-year-old Edward Morgan. Morgan was just 22 years old in 1984 and was a familiar face in the area as he lived a few miles away from Mary Jane's workplace. To confirm their suspicions, the FBI agents then surveilled Morgan's West Dallas home for a week where he lived alone. On February 15, 2022, a Dallas police detective and an FBI agent grabbed the trash that Morgan had dumped in front of his house. From it, a soda bottle and 2 water bottles were sent to a lab to undergo forensic testing. The DNA from the bottles positively matched the DNA taken during the autopsy. On February 18, 2022, after 38 years, Morgan was arrested and charged with capital murder. Her family was grateful to the investigators who never stopped working on the case. The news brought closure to the family as they finally knew who was responsible for taking Mary Jane away from them. Selena wrote in a Facebook post, "I know you are looking down and happy that they finally got him." Sadly, their father, who wanted nothing more than to find his daughter's killer, did not see this day as he passed away in 2020. Morgan is currently being held in jail with his bail set at $500,000. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Viola Hagencourt was born on August 16, 1900 and grew up in a lovely home. Not much is known about her life. After divorcing her husband in 1928, she never remarried or even dated someone. It was before the Great Depression when the divorce occurred and Viola swore off men for the rest of her life. Despite loneliness, she never complained about anything in her life. She was known as a happy, generous, and friendly woman among family members and neighbors. In 1980, Viola was living in the Pebble Cove apartment complex, located on the 2500 block of West Winton Road in Anaheim, California, after moving from her longtime home in Milwaukee. Apparently, her family believed that the apartment complex in Anaheim was a safer community for a lone woman, which was also closer to the family members. A decision that would come back to haunt them. Viola regularly chatted with other residents and visitors outside her apartment and was often seen walking around the building. One of her neighbors, who was a high school student at the time, found Viola very sweet and called her grandma. She often took cookies to the elderly woman. In the evening, she propped open her door with a Campbell's soup can, a worrisome habit for an elderly woman, according to some neighbors who thought it was unsafe. Concerns would no longer be only concerns for the well-wishers of Viola in the early 1980s. A neighbor grew worried when Viola was not seen leaving her apartment for several days. They entered her apartment on February 18, 1980, only to make a horrific discovery. When authorities reached the scene, they found the elderly widow's body sprawled out on her bed. She was gagged with a torn pillow cover, which had been forced into her mouth. Multiple ribs of her body were broken due to a merciless beating. Blood stains were found on the bed under her pelvic area, and empty beer cans were found in the apartment. The cause of death was suffocation from the gag in her mouth. Although there were no marks of a forced entry into the apartment, signs of struggle were present in the bedroom. It was concluded that the old woman tried to fend off her assailant, but turned out to be no match for him. The medical examiner ruled that she was brutally raped before her demise, and semen was collected from the body. Viola was only 6 months shy of celebrating her 80th birthday when her life was ended in this heinous manner. However, the question of who raped and killed the elderly woman had no straight answer. Despite some physical evidence, investigators were far away from identifying possible suspects. Eventually, they would have to wait 4 decades before the mystery would be solved. As years went by, this case became one of the oldest cold cases in Anaheim City. In September 2020, the detectives decided to reopen the cold case. It was time to reinvestigate the case under the light of new DNA technologies, which had successfully brought closure to several decades-old unsolved cases across the country. With assistance from the Orange County Crime Lab and the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force, using new DNA technologies, a possible suspect was finally identified in 2021. The suspect in this horrendous crime was Andre William Lapierre, a man who struggled with alcoholism throughout his life. Due to his alcoholism, he lasted only a year in the military as he was discharged following an alcohol-related car accident. Along with alcoholism, he also had a reputation for abuse. In 1980, Lapierre and his wife separated, and she filed a restraining order against him. Lapierre was not a complete stranger to Viola. Lepper's sister Denise lived in the same apartment complex where he lived for some time and met Viola a couple of times. Sometime in the 90s, Lepper moved to the east, living in several places including Washington, Wyoming, and Arizona, and New Mexico. There he worked as a truck driver as well as a plumber. He married twice, had 2 children, and went on to live his life peacefully until he was arrested in April 2021 from his Alamogordo home in New Mexico on the charge of murder. In the trial, LaPayer said that his connection to Viola was much more than meeting a couple of times. He claimed that Viola seduced him, and they had consensual sexual encounters on 2 occasions, one shortly before the murder. But he denied killing or beating her and said that she was alive and well, and was even giggling when he came out from her apartment. Though his current wife, sister, and stepson didn't believe that he was capable of killing someone. His story of being seduced sounded ridiculous, and the jury did not buy it. On May 13, 2022, a 65-year-old Andre William LaPayer was convicted of the murder and sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 79-year-old Viola Hagencourt in 1980. With a resolution after 41 years, Viola's family said in a statement, "Our grandmother, Viola Clara, was a beautiful, happy soul and did not deserve being violated in her final years of life. They were grateful, however, that the killer was brought to justice." Born on May 5, 1976, Sonia Mejia achieved the American dream at a young age. By 2006, at the age of 29, she was living with her common-law husband and her 8-year-old son and was 6 months pregnant with her second child. They lived in the Pleasant Fairway Apartments, located at approximately 11th West and 3900 South in Taylorsville, Utah. To support her family, she worked part-time at a local McDonald's. But the dream would be shattered one fateful morning in early February 2006. Sonia was home alone on February 9, 2006. At around 6 p.m., her husband returned home from work and made a gruesome discovery. He called the authorities after finding his wife breathless and unresponsive on the floor. The crime scene clearly pointed towards a homicide, which investigators concluded to be a robbery gone wrong. An autopsy on Sonia's body later showed that she had been sexually assaulted before being killed by strangulation. Tragically, Sonia's 24-week-old fetus also did not survive. Multiple items were missing from the apartment, which included 3 pieces of jewelry that belonged to Sonia: a heart-shaped ruby ring, a diamond ring, and a religious pendant fastened to a gold chain. Her car, a gold 4-door Ford Escort, was also stolen from the apartment and was located 4 days later in the parking lot of the Fairfield Inn at 590 West and 4500 South. Unidentified fingerprints and DNA evidence were discovered inside her apartment in the form of a bag of Cheetos and a Coke bottle, items that were not supposed to be there. So investigators concluded that they must have belonged to the killer. Unexpectedly, the investigators found a witness after interrogating neighbors for information. At around 11:30 a.m. on the day of the murder, a neighbor saw a Hispanic male talking to Sonia at the front door of her residence. The witness then observed him entering the apartment and assaulting Sonia. The man grabbed Sonia by the throat and struck her with such force that she fell to the floor, and then the assailant kicked the door shut. Sadly, even after witnessing the violent attack, the neighbor failed to alert the authorities, which ultimately cost the young mother her life. The man was described as a short-haired Hispanic male with a medium build, approximately 5 feet 6 inches in height and 20 to 29 years in age. Though it was deemed enough evidence to identify a suspect, police were unable to do so despite having fingerprints and a physical description of a killer. The authorities believed it to be a random attack until 2 years later, when the killer struck again on the same day and in the same area. Damiana Castillo was born in Mexico City, Mexico on March 18, 1950. Little is known about her early life, but she was a loving mother and grandmother. She was known to have a very gentle attitude and shared kind words and blessings with everyone she crossed paths with. One neighbor described her as a prompt lady who had never been late for work and never forgot to attend church. Her 2 children, 1 son and 1 daughter, and her 5 grandchildren adored her to death. In 2008, 57-year-old Damiana lived at an apartment at 4000 South Redwood Road in Salt Lake City, Utah, just a mile from where Sonia Mejia used to live. On a tragic February morning, police would be called to witness a horrific crime scene. On February 9, 2008, Damiana's son went to check up on his mother after she did not show up at church like she did every Sunday. There, poor Damiana was lying in her apartment, partially covered with a pillow with ligature marks on her neck. Police noted the signs of a fight in the apartment, including an overturned table. Damiana's pocketbook and wallet were found abandoned on a couch, and her jewelry box had also been disturbed. DNA was collected from the victim's neck, while a latent fingerprint was found on her purse. At first, this murder was believed to be a separate attack similar to Sonia's. However, excluding the age factor, these two murders had extreme similarities between them. But from 2009, investigators conclusively believed that it was the deeds of one person after the biological evidence linked both slayings. Nonetheless, both cases could not be solved at the time due to the DNA and fingerprints not matching a person present on the criminal database. In 2010, prosecutors used the DNA profile to charge the unknown suspect with 2 counts of aggravated murder, referring to him as John Doe, since his identity could not be specified. The killer earned his name as the February 9th killer, indicating the date of the crimes. Though the killer was not considered a serial killer, for years, police in West Valley City and Taylorsville would have extra officers on patrol on February 9th in order to prevent a third slaying. Over the years, these 2 cases received much-needed media attention, but no particular breakthrough could be earned through that. It would all change in 2016, when the FBI maintained automated fingerprint identification system reported that prints taken from the scene had been matched to a person. Juan Antonio Arreola Murillo Arreola is a 41-year-old Mexican resident who was living in the U.S. in 2008. According to court records, he was arrested by Salt Lake City police in July of the same year for a fraud and theft case and pleaded guilty. The address listed for Arreola in the 2008 case was the same apartment complex where Sonia was killed. However, he had multiple other addresses listed in court records, and it was unclear if Arreola was indeed a neighbor of either Sonia or Damiana. Arreola was deported from the U.S. back to his home country Mexico in October 2008 and has been living there since. In 2017, prosecutors amended the John Doe charges and the court issued an arrest warrant for Arreola. Although the killer's identity was unfolded to the investigators, it was not public due to the suspect living in another jurisdiction. The charging documents were unsealed after he had been extradited to Utah from Mexico. He was charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of aggravated burglary, and 1 count of aggravated robbery. If found guilty, he could face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Margaret Brooke was a hardworking elderly woman who lived her life to the fullest until it was tragically cut short. Helen lived all by herself in a 2-bedroom apartment at the Garden Apartment Buildings in the Mojave Desert town of Apple Valley, California. She was a well-spoken, attractive, and respected lady in the community, and everyone had only good things to say about her. A tenant would later describe her as a cautious woman, due to her living alone in the apartment. Helen was very dedicated to her work. For 20 long years, she worked for San Bernardino Valley College in the food services department. However, she later shifted to a different work line to experience other things in life. In 1985, Helen was working 2 jobs. She sold clothing at a fashion boutique called Lolo's in the Apple Valley admirably. 63-year-old Helen would model for the clothes that the store would put on fashion shows. She also worked as a bug keeper at a store right across Highway 18 at the bowling alley, which at the time was known as Gold Strike Lanes. On July 5, 1985, a Friday, Helen did not show up for work, an extremely unusual thing for her to do. Her boss called and called, but nobody answered. The concerned co-workers then called the sheriff's department for a welfare check. When officers drove down Highway 18 to the Garden Apartments, the door of Helen's apartment was unlocked. They found her lifeless body lying inside as they entered the scene. Not much evidence was present at the crime scene. However, DNA was collected from the scene, but nothing came of it since DNA technology was in its infancy back then. Autopsy results concluded that she died from strangulation by a nylon stocking. Despite conducting several interviews and polygraph tests, detectives could not identify a positive suspect, and the Apple Valley murder case remained unsolved for many years. In 2009, the case was re-examined and numerous items were sent for DNA testing. A DNA profile was developed for a suspect, but there were no matches in the DNA database. In 2021, cold case homicide investigators reopened the case and conducted further analysis of the unidentified DNA profile. The testing produced positive results, identifying a suspect named Robert Eugene Wertman. Wertman was a former resident of Apple Valley who lived close to Highway 18. The name was not entirely unknown for the investigation. As a matter of fact, Wertman was considered a person of interest in the original investigation and was even interrogated at the time. Investigators learned that Wertman, then 37, met Helen in the days before her murder and returned to her apartment between July 3rd and July 5th. However, he claimed to have no knowledge of the crime and even denied going to the apartment. Prove his involvement in the murder. As fate would have it, he didn't stay a free bird for long. In August 1985, just a month after he murdered Helen, Wertman was arrested on suspicion of attempting to rape a woman at the Cocky Bowl restaurant and bar on Highway 395 in Victorville. He also had a Sonoma County rape conviction from 1978. With an extensive sexually violent criminal history, Wertman died in prison in 1995 while serving a 22-year sentence in San Bernardino County. Janet K. Yeary was born on May 14, 1953, as the only daughter of Winford and Mary and Runyon. She grew up in a nice house in Tipton, Indiana, with her two brothers. After graduating from Tipton High School in 1971, she focused on starting a family. By 2004, at the age of 51, Janet lived in Kokomo, Indiana, near her daughter. She worked as a lab manager for 16 years at CNB Optical One in Kokomo and was known for being very good at her job. Janet and her daughter Carly Martin lived close to each other in the same neighborhood on North Appleton Way in Kokomo. Janet loved spending time with her granddaughter, her favorite thing to do. She also enjoyed gardening, using her computer, listening to music, and being outdoors. Holidays were important to Janet, and she loved cooking big meals for her family, even if it was a small gathering. On Thanksgiving in 2004, Janet prepared a large meal at her home for her family to enjoy. Unfortunately, it would be the last thing she ever did. The next day, which was Black Friday, Carly became worried when Janet didn't show up for the Thanksgiving dinner they had planned. Panic struck her when repeated calls were unanswered. She had a gut feeling that something terrible had happened. Growing concerned, she went to her mother's place to check in on her. The garage door of Janet's home was open. Carly unlocked the front door with a key and walked into her mother's home. There, 51-year-old Janet was lying, dead. The turkey was in the oven, which was still running. The conditions of her body, it was apparent that she had been brutally murdered. With a broken heart and tears in her eyes, Carly called the police. The Kokomo Police Department arrived at the house a few minutes later. There was not much evidence to collect from the crime scene. Although some blood was found at the crime scene, it was not enough to build a DNA profile. Police theorized that Janet most likely did not know her attacker, but let them in for some reason. Preliminary reports suggested that a struggle had taken place between Janet and her attacker. From the fact that the food had been left half done, they also concluded that Janet had been dead from the day of Thanksgiving. The murder shocked the close-knit community of Kokomo. No one had any idea who would want to kill a sweet old lady who greeted everybody. The crime scene was not giving away anything either. Although Janet's mourning family wanted nothing more than for her killer to be caught, with a lack of evidence, the investigation was not going anywhere. There were some sightings of a possible killer, as police found out in their investigation. Some neighbors had seen a white vehicle leaving the area at high speed around the time Janet was murdered. Still, the information did not lead the police anywhere. A ray of hope was seen 2 months after the murder when police identified a person of interest. Danny Case, a resident of Peru, had reportedly been going door to door to call for a ride. He seemed like a possible killer after a previous report indicated that Danny had been wanted in Miami County on suspicion of murder. 2 months later, on January 25, 2005, investigators got a big break when Danny ended up being apprehended, when he was arrested at Indianapolis International Airport on an outstanding warrant. But before Kokomo detectives could speak to him, he hung himself in his holding cell at the airport. According to Kokomo police, all the evidence pointed towards one man, Danny Case. However, there was insufficient physical evidence linking the deceased man to the crime. For years, people speculated the possibility of Danny being the killer of Janet, without ever coming to a conclusion. Perhaps the case would remain forever in the cold case files, if a witness had not come forward decades later. On January 14, 2022, Kokomo police announced the closure of Janet Yerry's murder case, due to a recent break in the investigation. According to the police, an acquaintance of Danny Case had recently come forward and told investigators that Danny once confessed to him about killing an elderly woman on North Apperson, right where Janet lived. The acquaintance had further said that Donnie knocked on the woman's door, asked about using her phone to call for a ride, and then killed her. In addition to Janet's death, Danny had also reportedly told the acquaintance that he had beaten an elderly man to death in Howard County. In light of this new information, Kokomo County investigators met with Yuri's family regarding the closure of Janet's case. After a lengthy conversation, the family finally agreed to officially close the case with an exceptional clearance due to the suspect being deceased. So after 17 years, this cold case was solved with the perpetrator eluding mortal justice. We understand this is a difficult time for the family, as these conversations open the wounds that the senseless tragedy left with her family. A statement said in the press release, "Our condolences remain with Janet Yeary and her amazing family. We pray for peace for all of you." On the morning of July 15, 1982, a gravedigger found a badly decomposed body of a woman at Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Blairstown, New Jersey. She was lying on her back near a steep bank by a creek. Her face was severely beaten, making it hard to recognize her, and her eye color couldn't be seen. She wore a red shirt and a peasant-style skirt, but no underwear was found. It was difficult to determine if she had been sexually assaulted due to the advanced decay. A gold cross necklace was tangled in her hair, and she wore earrings on her left ear. Red nail polish was on her right hand, but not on the left. There were no surgical scars, birthmarks, or tattoos. Her front two teeth were darker than the others. No signs of assault were found. Forensic experts estimated her age to be between 14 and 18, and she had never been pregnant or given birth. The body had been exposed to the elements for days or possibly weeks before it was found. The hot and humid weather conditions made it more difficult for the forensic department to determine the specifics surrounding the time of death, revealed that she had attempted to fight back against the attacker. On January 22, 1983, Jane Doe was given a proper burial. Sadly though, no family members were present at her funeral as her identity remained a mystery. Moved by the tragic story of this poor young woman, the townspeople donated the cost of the victim's coffin, headstone, and burial plot. Dead among strangers, remembered by all, were the heartbreaking markings on the tombstone. There was a possible sighting of Princess Doe before her murder. In an attempt to find information about this unidentified victim, detailed pictures of her clothing were shared with the public. After seeing images of the clothing in a newspaper, a woman reported to officials that she remembered seeing a girl wearing the same clothing purchasing on July 13, 1982, just 2 days before her body was found. However, like several others, this lead led nowhere. On June 30, 1983, Princess Doe became the first person to be entered into the FBI's National Computerized Unidentified Deceased Files. Through the years, the focus was shifted to many suspects, ranging from local residents to serial killers. However, all of them were eventually cleared and frustratingly police were back at square one. For many years, Princess Doe was wrongly thought to be Diane Janice Dye, a missing teenager from San Jose, California, who vanished on July 30, 1979. This theory held court with several law enforcement officials in the state of New Jersey, and who went so far as to declare Diane Dye as Princess Doe in a press conference. However, Lieutenant Eric Krantz, Princess Doe case's original lead investigator, maintained that Diane Dye was not a plausible candidate for Princess Doe's identity. Krantz's insights were backed up by Diane's family and the investigators in California who were disgusted by the conduct of the New Jersey law enforcement. Princess Doe's DNA was compared with a DNA sample from Diane's mother, Patricia, and it was conclusively determined that Diana Dye was not Princess Doe. In 2005, a convicted serial killer named Arthur Kinlaw wrote a letter to the police, expressing his desire to confess to another murder. According to the New York Times, Kinlaw had previously been charged with killing and dumping a girl's body in the East River. In 2005, Kinlaw, whom the police believed had run a prostitution ring in the past, wanted to tell the investigators about a young woman he had murdered in New Jersey. However, Kinlaw's claims couldn't be corroborated by the police due to a lack of substantial evidence at that time. Though investigators had collected DNA evidence from Princess Doe's body, it was only in recent years that they were able to test her earthly remains. In 2007, the body was exhumed and the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification analyzed the skeletal remains of Princess Doe. In 2012, a composite sketch was made to identify Princess Doe using DNA technologies, but it didn't lead to any new information. Then, in 2021, the Astrea Forensics Lab analyzed DNA from her teeth and eyelashes, and were successfully able to extract DNA from those samples, which were initially thought to be of no value. Indeed, Princess Doe's eyelashes and teeth were the keys to discovering her identity. After the first clue was grasped, other details started filling in. In 2022, investigators were able to finally identify Princess Doe as Dawn Olenek, a 17-year-old Long Island resident. Princess Doe's 40th anniversary was the day marked for the announcement of her identification. Dawn Olenek was born in a Christian home on August 5, 1964 in West Babylon, New York. In 1982, 17-year-old Dawn was a high school junior living with her mother and sister in Bohemia, New York. She left home on June 24, 1982 at her mother's request. The mother wanted Olenek out of the house. The reason why has never been clarified, and she was never seen alive again. Detectives believe that after leaving her home, somewhere, somehow, Dawn had crossed paths with Arthur Kinlaw. Kinlaw then tried to force her into sex work for a prostitution ring that he and his wife Donna ran in Suffolk County, New York throughout the 1980s. When she refused, he killed her in an attempt to get rid of a witness. Following the identification of Princess Doe as Dawn Olenek, Arthur Kinlaw was reconsidered as a suspect and later charged with Olenek's murder. If convicted, he will be facing another life sentence, along with the 2 he is already serving. For 40 years, law enforcement has not given up on Princess Doe. Warren County Prosecutor James Pfeiffer stated in a news conference. He added that science and technology played crucial parts in solving Olenek's murder. Olenek's surviving relatives sat with her photo pinned to their lapels at the press conference. For over 40 years, Dawn had been resting in a grave in the town of Blairstone, New Jersey. Now her family is deciding whether or not she should stay in New Jersey or come home to New York. Whatever their decision might be, investigators are relieved to finally have identified her and given Dawn Olenek her identity back. In the era of DNA advancements, victims deserve much more than a gravestone with no name on it. Hopefully in the future, no family will have to live their lives wondering about their lost loved ones. On July 31, 1960, a school teacher from Las Vegas named Russell Allen was looking for rocks to decorate his garden in a desert area near Congress, Arizona, just off of Old Alamo Road, 1.5 miles from Highway 93. After just a few moments, he stumbled upon something so horrific that would haunt him for decades. In the creek bed of Sandwash, a little girl's mother, badly decomposing, partially buried body was concealed. He wasted no time in notifying the authorities. As local police reached the scene, they found the body wearing a blue blouse and reddish shorts. The adult-sized rubber thong sandals that she was wearing were cut down to fit her feet, and leather straps fastened the sandals. Her perfect set of baby teeth remained intact. Her toenails and fingernails were painted bright red. There were no signs of fractured or broken bones, which ruled out the history of abuse, suggesting that this was a random attack. The remains were, however, charred. Detectives believe that the perpetrator tried to dispose of her body by burning it, but could not entirely accomplish the task. He then changed his plan and buried the body in the desert, but did not do a very good job of that either. An autopsy concluded that the body belonged to a child. The investigators estimated that the little girl was in the age range of 2 to 7 years, with an approximate height of 3 feet 5 inches. She weighed between 50 and 60 pounds. She was Caucasian and had brown hair, but it could have been previously tinted or dyed auburn. However, no one could tell if she had any birthmarks or distinctive spots on her body, due to extreme decomposition and charring. Her cause of death could not be determined, but officials considered this case a homicide based on the circumstances. It was a tragic case all around. Not only did the killer get away, even after such a monstrous act, but nobody even knew who this poor child was. However, people in the nearby Prescott community did their best to honor her. Residents in the nearby central North Arizona community of Prescott raised money for a funeral and even arranged florists. A local mortuary donated its services for the little girl they lovingly dubbed Little Miss Nobody, since nobody came forward to identify her. There was a lot of coverage from the media on this case in the first month of the gruesome discovery, but there were no leads to follow. Although the local sheriff's department continued their search for months, even interrogating every child sex offender in that area, yet nothing ever came of it. The case went cold as every clue turned out to be a dead end. Throughout the years, many desperate families came to the sheriff's department asking if she was their missing child, but none were a match. Then in 2021, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, a Texas-based laboratory, to see if advanced DNA testing could help solve the mystery of Little Miss Nobody. Although the preserved evidence was not strong enough for reconstruction and building a DNA profile with improved technology, the lab built a DNA profile that had not been possible in the past. Indeed, the lab returned the identity to authorities in February 2022, and the mystery surrounding a little girl's identity was finally solved after 6 decades. Little Miss Nobody was 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos. She was born on September 6, 1955, with her mother, grandmother, and 6 other relatives. Sharon and her 2 older siblings lived in Alamogordo. She had no contact with her soldier father since he left the family when Sharon was a baby. The Gallegos were not wealthy. The love was unconditional in this tight-knit family. Her loved ones described Sharon as a happy-go-lucky child who loved running errands with her mother and enjoyed playing outside with the neighborhood kids along with her siblings. At approximately 3 p.m. on July 21, 1960, Sharon was kidnapped in an alley near her Virginia Avenue home while playing with her 2 cousins. The eyewitnesses said a couple offered to buy Sharon some candy and clothes in exchange for getting in the car with them. Sharon refused, but was dragged to the vehicle anyway. The car was described as a dark green 1951 or 1952 model Dodge or Plymouth sedan. The man was described as a fair, thin Caucasian with a long nose and sandy-colored straight hair, whereas the witnesses described the woman as a short, stout individual in her 30s. After loading Sharon into the car, the vehicle sped away. Once her cousins told Sharon's mom about what happened, she immediately called the police. Roadblocks were set up in nearby places but failed to apprehend the abductor. Investigators were concerned that Sharon was probably stalked for days or weeks before the abduction, but could not find out the perpetrators. Shockingly, in 1960, Sharon was not considered to be Little Miss Nobody because the remains looked much older than Sharon. This case was always open until the identification of Little Miss Nobody. Sadly, Sharon's parents passed away before the mystery was solved. Regardless, the surviving family members of Sharon were relieved to know that she had been found. Unfortunately, no new information on her killer has surfaced. On June 3, 1993, a trucker stopped to relieve himself on the side of the westbound State Route 152, also known as the Pacheco Pass Highway near Gilroy, California, when something grabbed his attention. It looked like the partially skeletal remains of a human body. After authorities reached the scene, they found a decomposing female body wearing blue jeans and a blue t-shirt with a blue jacket. She had white underwear and white Nike socks with blue stripes. Her brown tennis shoes were also recovered from the scene. After the body was taken to the coroner's office for an autopsy, many details about the victim's description and her murder were revealed. The forensic scientist concluded that the body belonged to a white woman, but she also had Hispanic characteristics. Most likely at the end of May 1993, she featured medium-length brown hair with brown eyes. At about 5 feet 2 inches tall, she weighed around 130 pounds. The 5-inch scar was found on her abdomen, possibly resulting from gallbladder surgery. She also had track marks across her arm indicating drug abuse. The manner of death was ruled a homicide by strangulation, and the body seemed to have been dumped after the murder. Even with all of these details, detectives faced difficulty finding out who this woman was. She did not match any missing persons in the area. No one came forward to claim her, nor could detectives connect any of the evidence to any person. Eventually, they started referring to her as the Blue Pacheco Jane Doe. The case went cold soon after the murder. Then in 2006, Keith Hunter Jesperson, otherwise known as the infamous Happy Face Killer, submitted a letter to the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office admitting to sexually assaulting and killing an unknown female along the dirt turnout on Highway 152. Between 1990 and 1995, Jesperson strangled 8 women, including prostitutes and transients in several U.S. states, such as California, Florida, Nebraska, Oregon, Washington, and Wyoming. He is currently incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary. He was known as the Happy Face Killer. Due to the happy face drawing, he always included in his letters taunting the police. He claimed he met her at a truck stop on Interstate 5 in Corning, California, and offered her a ride after buying her lunch. During the ride, the woman talked about having relatives in the Sacramento, California area. Jesperson believed she might have been a prostitute. In Williams, California, they engaged in sexual activities, and then he strangled her before driving on toward Gilroy, California. Pacheco passed on Highway 152 and tossed her body off the turnout. Although he mentioned her name being Cindy or Carla, he too had no idea about her true identity. A year after this confession, he pled guilty to her murder and received a life sentence. It was the rarest of situations where authorities had a convict behind bars without identification of the victim. Blue Pacheco Jane Doe remained one of 3 unidentified victims of the Happy Face serial killer for decades. In 2019, detectives from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office began utilizing the new DNA technology advancements in an attempt to identify Blue Pacheco Jane Doe while partnering with the nonprofit DNA Doe Project. Finally, in April 2022, she was discovered to be Patricia Skipple from Colton, Oregon. Patricia Skipple was born May 29, 1948, and grew up in Colton, Oregon. Patsy, as she preferred to be called, was a mother of 2 and a resident of Oregon. She was described as a gentlewoman who loved her family more than anything. In 1992, she left her home and also the city in the middle of the night after an argument with her husband. She never returned. For years, Patsy's family wondered where she was and if she'd ever come home. It was only after detectives paid a visit to Patsy's family saying that she was identified that they came to know her fate. We can only hope that they heal knowing that justice was served for Patsy. In the late morning hours of June 16, 1974, a man was searching for driftwood with his 2 teenage sons in a condensed wooded area of Singer Island in North Palm Beach, Florida. The trio was combing through the area along the eastern edge of the Intracoastal Waterway, just 2 miles south of Lost Tree Village, when they came across what looked like skeletal remains. Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office investigators soon reached the area to discover a gruesome scene. The remains appeared to be tied to a tree. Amongst the bones, they found mostly deteriorated clothing, including a black knit pullover sweater that was trimmed at the bottom, a gray waistband and long gray sleeves that were capped at the shoulders, and size 5 yellow panties with yellow stripes, which was believed to have originated from a pair of denim high-crop shorts. The partial remains were brought in for examination. The remains were in such bad condition that the medical examiner could not determine the cause of death in the autopsy. Although holes in the sweater indicated gunshot wounds, however, no bullet casing were found at the scene. There were definite signs that animal activity had scattered the remains. The medical examiner concluded that the remains belonged to a white female between the ages of 14 and 25. She weighed approximately 83 to 103 pounds and stood anywhere from 4 feet 11 inches to 5 feet 2 inches. She most likely had blonde hair with a red tint to it. Due to the level of decomposition at the time of her discovery, her eye color could not be determined. Regardless of that, an abstract profile of the victim was created. When media reports first came out, the Singer Island Jane Doe was believed to be Bonnie Robinson, a young girl who had gone missing from Detroit, Michigan. Yet upon further investigation, this theory was ruled out. Over the years, many attempts were made to identify the young girl. Then, in April of 2014, her body was exhumed to collect more physical evidence. In 2015, a DNA profile was developed, but there was no match in Cody's, suggesting that the girl likely had no criminal history. After developing a DNA profile, several other missing women were able to be ruled out through DNA comparison. In 2019, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office prepared a new facial reconstruction of the girl, but no one came forward with any leads. Finally, in December 2021, the DNA was sent to a genealogy lab to comb through genetic databases and try to develop a family tree based on the recovered DNA. In March 2022, the ancestry was successfully traced, leading to the identification of distant relatives of Singer Island Jane Doe. After relentless efforts, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office was able to contact potential family members. Additional DNA testing of surviving family members confirmed Jane Doe's identity as 15-year-old Suzanne Poole. Susan Poole was born February 12, 1957. She lived in a trailer park with her family in Fort Lauderdale. The 15-year-old went missing from Broward County, Florida in December of 1972. Susan was a troubled teen. On many previous occasions, she ran away from home. She often hitched rides with strangers, which was common in those days, so her family was not initially alarmed when she went missing in 1972, believing she had left voluntarily and would soon return home as she normally did. Susan was never heard from or seen again. As decades passed, her family members always wondered whether or not she had left of her own volition. The only possessions Susan left behind were some clothing and her pocketbook, which was later discovered at her friend's home. It would take over 5 decades to put all the clues together to what happened to Susan Poole. The saddest part of this is despite getting her identity back 50 years after her tragic demise, her parents did not live long enough to see this day. There are still no leads as to who her killer was. On July 10, 1991, the staff of the Whitehall Motel in El Dorado, Arkansas heard a gunshot from room 121. Moments later, a man was seen fleeing the scene with a gun in his hand. While people at the hotel called 911, the man ran to the parking lot and sped away in a car. When police entered the room, they discovered a deceased woman with a gunshot wound to the head. She was between 5 feet 10 inches and 5 feet 11 inches and weighed 162 pounds. The victim was a Caucasian woman between the ages of 18 and 30. She had blue eyes and about 9-inch long brown hair which had been dyed blonde previously. She wore a white t-shirt, acid-wash jeans with a black belt, white tennis shoes with white ankle socks, and a gold-colored chain bracelet on her right arm. As a distinctive identification, she had a birthmark under her left breast. She had freckles, 2 piercings in her left ear, and 3 piercings in her right ear. Bruises were found on her right eye and left wrist, suggesting that she most likely was battered and abused before her death. An identification card was discovered along with the body with the victim's photo and the name Cheryl Anwick. Yet after authorities tracked down the real Cheryl Anwick, who was very much alive, authorities realized the victim was not Cheryl, nor was she Mercedes Cheryl Kaufman, Kelly Lee Carr, Shannon, or Sharon Wiley, all aliases she used while she was alive. Although police found many of her friends, nobody knew her real identity. Ultimately, she was named the El Dorado Jane Doe. Soon, police apprehended the killer, James McAlphin, the victim's ex-boyfriend and occasional pimp, and charged him with first-degree murder and second-degree battery. Jane Doe met McAlphin shortly after she had moved to Dallas. However, the relationship was rocky from the start and abuse was a constant factor. Throughout her relationship, She was in and out of the emergency room to treat the injuries inflicted by her boyfriend. The situation deteriorated so quickly that even the local police, along with her friends, tried to get her out of the relationship. That effort was successful when in June 1991, Jane Doe left McAlpin despite his repeated threats to kill her. Jane Doe then went to live at a friend's apartment. McAlpin's threats continued after he learned that she was seeing someone else. Jane Doe finally met with McAlpin after he called, promising her money. They set up a meeting at the Whitehall Motel. Her friends warned her not to go, but she went anyway. She said she needed the money to send presents to her children. It was revealed that the argument started right after Jane Doe entered the motel room, where McAlpin was already there waiting for her. She ran out of the door at some point, but he chased her to the parking lot and dragged her back to the room. Moments after a gunshot was heard, McAlpin then fled the scene. McAlpin's version of events was a bit different though. He claimed that she snatched the gun from him and shot herself. He then fled, fearing that he would be blamed. For obvious reasons, the jury did not buy his story. McAlpin ended up accepting a plea deal for second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years for the crime. In all of this chaos, one thing remained unchanged: the confusion regarding Jane Doe's identity. Who was she? After McAlpin's arrest, police hoped to unravel the victim's identity, but he declined to reveal anything without money in exchange for information. However, detectives believed that McAlpin had no idea about her true identity since he knew her as Mercedes. A Bible was also found in Doe's possession that contained several names of the Stroud family. When police reached the Stroud family, they were convinced that Jane Doe was not related to this family since they were African American and she was white. However, she had lived with them for some time in mid to late 1990 under the name Cheryl and Wick, a runaway from Louisiana who had just moved there from Minneapolis, Minnesota. A bit more information came to light after the police dug deeper. While staying in Dallas, Jane Doe worked at a local KFC full-time, but occasionally engaged in prostitution to pay her bills. Between 1990 and 1991, she was arrested 4 times for different charges, including prostitution, public lewdness, and writing bad checks, each under the name Cheryl and Wick. Although police had reconstructed some of Jane Doe's movements before her death, unmasking her identity seemed an impossible task considering she told numerous different stories to different people. To some people, she said that she used to be a stripper, was from out of town, and had 2 kids raised by her mother with whom she did not get along. To others, she had said she was in the witness protection program and that her father was in the mafia. Some had heard that she was wanted for bank robberies on the East Coast. There were even rumors of her being on the run for the murder of a truck driver. But none of these could be proven as a fact, and she remained the El Dorado Jane Doe for decades. This case is very bizarre considering, unlike most other Jane Doe cases, authorities had real-life photos of the victim, her killer behind bars, and people knew her before her death. The only puzzle piece missing was her true identity. In 2019, Yolanda McCleary, a genealogy researcher and crime scene investigator, approached local law enforcement with her team to help identify Jane Doe. After several search efforts and DNA profile work, Yolanda and her team were finally able to track down a distant cousin using GED-Match. From there, they were able to reconstruct a family tree. After more than 30 years in 2022, El Dorado Jane Doe's real identity was finally made known. The woman was identified as Kelly, whose last name is kept hidden to respect her family's privacy. In 1968, Kelly was born in Virginia to a woman named Brenda. She grew up knowing her stepfather as a father figure because her biological father had no idea she even existed. Kelly had 1 younger sister. Soon Brenda divorced her then husband and she remarried 2 more times after that. After 3 failed marriages, Brenda moved to Virginia Beach and Kelly and her sister went to live with her aunt. After about a year, Kelly came back to stay with her mother. At this time, she dropped out of school in 10th grade and began working at a beach jewelry kiosk. By this time, Brenda had developed a drug addiction and a penchant for stealing. In 1986, at the age of 18, she moved to Little Rock. She would spend roughly 3 years in the city, leaving in 1989. Kelly grew closer with her younger sister after moving to Florida in 1989. even briefly moving her sister in with her during her stint in Florida. From there, the two sisters went their separate ways when Kelly moved to Virginia in 1990, followed by Texas in 1991. Later that same year, Kelly eventually moved to El Dorado. This is where she spent the rest of her life until her ex-boyfriend murdered her on July 10, 1991. Kelly used several fake names to conceal her identity. Although Brenda did not seem to care about her daughter, the sister tried to find Kelly and always wondered where she was, although nobody formally reported her missing. Despite all the confusion surrounding Kelly's true identity, genetic scientists have once again managed to unravel the mystery. 33-year-old Derek Burdo and his wife, Shanelia Harris Burdo, lived in Forest Hill, North Texas. While they appeared normal to many, their marriage had deep-seated issues. They sought help from Reverend Danny Kirk, senior of Greater Sweet Home Missionary Baptist Church. After counseling, things seemed better, but Derek's mental problems resurfaced. He became paranoid about his wife's whereabouts and grew more aggressive. They returned to the church for help, and Derek received medical treatment. However, his condition worsened. On October 29, 2012, Derek drove his car into the church and attacked Reverend Danny Kirk Sr. with an electric guitar, killing him. Police subdued Derek with stun guns, but he died the same night. Shanelia Harris Burdo revealed that Derek was paranoid and believed he had been drugged. Investigation suggested he had been given PCP, likely by the Reverend. PCP is dangerous due to its adverse effects on behavior and perception. PCP is a hallucinogenic drug that causes mood disorders, paranoia, hostility, and physical and unimaginable. Electric guitar became a tool and weapon to kill a person. But this next one brings an unassuming terror all its own. In Northwest Florida, there lived a couple, Monica Gooden and Darius Johnson. They were in their early 20s and were nearly in a good relationship. They even had a baby who had died prematurely. And like the baby, the bond between the couple was dying too. Over a period of time, Darius felt a sense of pestering from Monica's behavior. She would often control him and say no to things he liked. Then came a day when Darius had it all. On Sunday, March 31st, 2013, Darius picked up his Xbox 360 console and killed his partner Monica Gooden at home in the 2200 block of Northwest 55th Terrace in Florida. Monica's body was discovered after he was caught attacking another woman, Geraldine Price, at a nearby apartment in Lauderhill. The cops found a bloody Xbox console and 3 knives near the body. From then on, the case got interesting. When the cops intervened, he said that killing someone born under Taurus's astrological sign was the only way to set his soul free. Wasn't even a Taurus. It was clear that Darius had mental health issues and wouldn't act on curing himself. A lot of it stems from that which resulted in the brutal death of his partner Monica Gooden. Darius was charged with burglary, double murder, and assault and was sentenced to life in prison. From a console being a deadly weapon, we now move on to the next unusual weapon that caused a lot of trouble. For a family, Darnell Alvarez and Daviana Blake were married in their 20s and they had a son. The family was small, but the plans weren't. To the rest of the neighborhood, they seemed like a normal family. But that wasn't the case at all. It was clear in the family that the patriarch was the one to discipline. Whatever he said would be the last word, and that got toxic within the family. And it caught on early. In 2013, Darnell Alvarez of Phoenix, Arizona, beat his 2-year-old son with a belt as his mother Daviana Blake failed to act, fearing Child Protective Services. What could the little kid have done to deserve such a gruesome fate? The 2-year-old wet his bed and was getting disciplined for that. That, of course, wasn't the only time. He was hit twice in the morning for wetting his bed, twice in the afternoon for defecating in his underwear, and later in the evening, which resulted in his death. The boy had bruises from the beating he got, which led to internal bleeding and a lacerated liver. On interrogation, the wife, Daviana Blake, said that she didn't intervene because she didn't want to upset her husband. Her parents were set to jail for child abuse and first-degree murder. And if you think filicide has only one face, wait for the next one, where a baby was choked. Sheena Arnold was born on March 29, 1980, and had a criminal past. There were a series of incidents that followed the act of filicide. She was convicted of abduction in 2000 and of forgery in 2002. China Arnold moved in with her boyfriend, Tyrell Talley, in Dayton, Ohio. They were living partners. In their 20s, they had children, and Paris Talley was one of them. Born in August 2005. But there was a problem. Tyrell Talley wasn't ready to take responsibility for the child. He also refused to believe that he was the father of the child. Tyrell Talley was an infidel in the relationship he had with China. China Arnold knew of this and later took the life of the infant. On August 29, 2005, when China was intoxicated, she placed her baby in the microwave for over 2 minutes when her boyfriend wasn't at home. The baby had died due to a high temperature. The baby had no external injuries but did have internal ones. The baby was taken to the hospital and was pronounced dead. This act of filicide not only devastated the family, but many others living within the vicinity. What was more troubling was that the father of the child was ready to blame the neighbor's kid for the said act. It was still hard to digest what these parents subjected their children to. China Arnold is currently serving a life sentence. An unusual case and an unusual weapon that destroyed an infant's life. This next weapon is as bizarre as the case. In April 2006, 29-year-old Patricia Ann McCullum was killed at Ravenwood Apartments on Old Kings Road. The killer was 61-year-old Jimmy Hackley. But how did he do it? It was his sweatpants through which he strangled the lady so vigorously that the blood vessels in her eyes burst. It took some time for the 61-year-old to do the act, but somehow he managed to do it. Jimmy tied Patricia up with a pair of pajamas and choked her with sweatpants. Before the murder, he had called Patricia several times, and that was how the investigators could connect him to the case. Moreover, Jimmy's relative also testified that Jimmy had shown up at his apartment looking distraught and asking for a ride out of town. The police found DNA evidence at the crime scene, which later resulted in the arrest of Jimmy Hackley. Jimmy now faces a life sentence. From sweatpants being a weapon of strangulation, we now move on to socks, which became a crucial part of the murder. Joanna Yates was a landscape architect from Hampshire, England, who lived with her partner in a large house in Bristol, England. She was really good at her profession and had many projects to her name. And to celebrate her success, she went out with her colleagues on the 17th of December 2010. And after that night, she had gone missing. There were many media reports and rumors around this case as it was heavily televised for the masses. After 9 days of searching, on December 25, 2010, the police found the body in Phelan. The landlord, Christopher Jeffries, was arrested and later released, but was vilified by the media. It was heavy duty for the cops as there was media pressure, public pressure, and a lack of willingness in their act. There was another man, an occupant of the third flat in the same building, Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old architectural engineer. He was arrested on January 20, 2011. After 2 days, he was charged with the murder of Joanna Yates. The prosecution had enough evidence to prove that Tabak was the murderer, and his trial started on October 4, 2011. Everyone had one question in mind: what exactly went down? Tabak killed Joanna in her apartment within minutes of her arrival. Tabak was tall, so he used all of his strength and might on her, forcing himself by pinning her down. He later dumped her body in Phelan, North Somerset, England, which the cops found on the 25th of December 2010. Tabak's DNA was found on the back of her knees, and he was sentenced to life in prison. All this time, the media had a major role to play. They became the outlet for the said crime, and many viewers were subjected to voyeurism. Come into the picture. Tabak used the sock that she wore to suffocate her and then strangle her. He later kept the sock with himself while the media trial was going on, up until his arrest. A sock took the life of a talented woman. But there are more unusual weapons on the list. Edward Benson and Katie Benson were an old married couple in their 60s. They had a normal family with 7 children and grandchildren who looked after them, but they preferred to live alone in West Milton, Ohio. The couple was in a stage of life where they were content, but that wasn't the case in its entirety. In the early hours of May 22, 1991, Katie Benson was beaten with a banjo in the head, and the second one was used after the first was destroyed by her husband, Edward Benson. Edward was charged with aggravated murder and was being held in the Miami County Jail. Katie Benson suffered massive injuries and later died while on the way to the hospital. It was a gruesome act by a family man. He was a banjo player in the Blue Cross Band. There were no concrete reasons as to why Edward would hit Katie. There was no history of domestic violence, only that they lived alone and the neighbors were well aware of them. The banjo made the act gruesome, and with the next weapon, it is quite horrific. The use of toilet lids as a weapon of murder has been a tool for film directors to show anger wrapped in violence for the characters of mob bosses. But in this case, it isn't the tool of cinema nor the tool of anger. It is rather bloody. In 2006, Marvin Joseph Hill, a 49-year-old pizza delivery man, used a stun gun to disable the 29-year-old Christina Jeanette Eubanks when she turned down his sexual advances. He then assaulted and murdered her by bashing her head repeatedly with the lid of her toilet seat. While on trial, he said that he dragged her from her apartment using a dog leash around her neck in Fort Sanders, Knoxville, Tennessee, and then dumped her body wrapped in a carpet in North Knoxville Creek. Marvin was sentenced to life in prison. From the toilet lid, we now move on to a pickle jar being used as a weapon. Daniel Cover-Basic was 12 when a 55-year-old man, Dwayne Hurley, approached him to take care of his dog while he ran an errand. Little did the 12-year-old know that it was the beginning of his grooming session. The parents were concerned at first, but when they found nothing on the 55-year-old, they let their son spend time with him. To their surprise, Dwayne Hurley offered to help the family when they were in a slump. The parents were extremely shocked to discover that on January 20th, 2010, Dwayne Hurley was murdered in their very home by their son. Daniel Cover-Basic smashed a pickle jar on the head of Dwayne Hurley and stabbed him 55 times until his knife broke. The victim was seen in a storm of anger. It was later found that the 55-year-old had been sodomizing the 12-year-old for a while. Dwayne Hurley was a pedophile, and the officials found child pornographic material on his computer. Daniel was sent to house arrest and was later released. After the deadly use of the pickle jar, we now move to a crucifix as an unusual weapon. Karen Walsh was a 45-year-old pharmacist in Newry. She was well-to-do and had a 2-year-old son. Marie Rankin was an 81-year-old Catholic living in Newry. She was Orthodox. They would often cross paths, exchanging pleasantries with each other. Marie Rankin would often tell Karen to be responsible and make an effort to take care of her child. Karen couldn't take the constant nagging that Marie passed on. On Christmas Day in Newry, Marie Rankin was beaten with a crucifix and was sexually assaulted. That day, Karen was drunk and angry. She lashed out at her with a crucifix that had been given as a wedding gift to Marie Rankin. The degradation further extended to Karen removing Marie's clothes and sexually abusing her. In the court of trial, Karen Walsh showed no remorse for the incident, and neither did she explain the reason for the said crime. It is hard to imagine how humans can extend their thoughts and act as evil as they can. The next weapon is a jump rope, which makes it even worse as a weapon of murder. In the Bronx lived a 5-year-old girl, Monique Fulgham, with her grandmother, mother, aunt, 4 siblings, and several other cousins. It was a joint family of mostly women in a building on the 7th floor, and it was all good until a sad day arrived. The 5-year-old girl was strangled, assaulted, and later hanged using the jump rope in her bedroom. All of the aforementioned crimes were committed in an empty house on the 7th floor where there were no men present in the apartment at the time. It was 6 in the evening when the baby's grandmother discovered the grisly body of her granddaughter hanging unconscious from the closet door. The 5-year-old was found dead while she was being taken to the hospital. The case is still unsolved. As gruesome as it can get, the next choice of weapon is a frying pan. Nora Peterson lived with her partner Michael Milczarek, an Elgin. The couple was well-to-do and had a pretty good relationship. As easy as it seemed on the surface, the couple would often argue over petty things. And one fine day, Nora Peterson struck her boyfriend with a frying pan over an argument that the couple have had. She hit him multiple times in the head. After the hit, he fell and then stopped breathing. Nora herself called the cops, and the scenario was then explained. It was later discovered that her boyfriend was hit with several other things. Nora was sentenced to jail for 22 years or first-degree murder. After the frying pan is used to kill, there is the fireplace poker, which acts as this tool of murder. In 2013, a burglar broke into a farmhouse to steal valuables, and when he was caught, he used the fireplace poker to hit the owner of the house. His intention to steal was fulfilled, but his unintentional killing led him to kill the other two. Meet Jaron Custer, who was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and burglary. After killing the owner of the farmhouse, he waited and killed the other 2 siblings later that evening. The bodies of Dean, Gary, and Chloe were all found by the police. The 2 brothers had multiple blunt force traumas to the neck and head, while Chloe had multiple blunt force traumas to the head along with stab wounds. He was sentenced to life in prison. And now we move to the last murder weapon on this list, which already seems deadly. Esteban Castillo and William Vasconello were good friends living in New Jersey. They would often work out and talk about life beyond being bodybuilders. But one fine day, Esteban Castillo was in a heated argument with William in his apartment in Paterson, New Jersey. Esteban used a 25-pound metal dumbbell and hit his friend multiple times until he died. He was charged with aggravated manslaughter. Esteban Castillo faces 15 years in prison, and to this day it is unclear what they were arguing about. A friend, a baby, a son, and a relative were all lost in these cases, and the choice of weapons used was all in proximity. Caledonia Charter Township, located in Kent County, Michigan, has a history dating back to its organization as a survey township in 1838. Situated about 10 miles southeast of Grand Rapids, it's part of the Grand Rapids metropolitan area. However, this seemingly normal location became the backdrop for a grim series of events. Sharon Gross, born to Jacob and Lois Gross, initially led a typical life. She got married, had 2 children, but eventually separated from her spouse due to differences. Struggling with loneliness after the separation, Sharon turned to drugs for comfort. Despite wanting to quit, her addiction pushed her into sex work to sustain herself and her drug habit. One late night on October 2nd, 1996, Sharon found herself in a troubling situation. The following day, October 3rd, 1996, a delivery person stumbled upon a body wrapped in a carpet during their regular rounds. They promptly informed Kent County officials. Kent County deputies reached 76th Street, southeast between Paterson and Craft Avenue and Caledonia Township, where they located a deceased female. The woman was 29 years old when this incident occurred, and her name was Sharon K. Hammock. She was sexually assaulted, strangled, stabbed twice in the head, hogtied, and dumped on the side of a highway. The assailant assaulted the victim, leaving DNA vaginally and rectally, as well as other items including a rope that was used to hogtie the victim. Sharon was a mother of 2 and 4 months pregnant when she was killed. This murder was one of the 12 Grand Rapid murder sprees in 1994. Although the police gathered all the DNA evidence present on the victim, they couldn't find the assailant due to a lack of resources and technology, and soon this case would turn cold. A string of crimes happened on the highways connecting the US, Canada, and Mexico borders over the years. There were over 500 murders along the highways of these countries, and over 200 possible suspects. These strings would also connect human trafficking that occurred across the states. The possibility of suspects being long-haul truck drivers was high due to the multi-jurisdictional nature of these heinous crimes. In 2006, Maryland State Police were investigating the homicide of a woman who was assaulted and stabbed to death. The assailant left DNA in that victim's body as well. The Highway Patrol has been heightened over the years due to the increasing number of crimes on the highways, and the murderer was very similar to that of Sharon's. Even after increased patrol by the police, they were still not able to get their hands on the murderer until 2022. On August 16, 2022, there was a regular traffic arrest of a man named Gary Artman. When police ran a check on his ID, they found that he was arrested in 1982 for a sex crime. He spent 10 years in jail in Michigan and was released in 1992. So the Mississippi Highway Patrol put him in custody and contacted the Kent County Sheriff's Office in Michigan. They verified his DNA with the crimes that occurred on the highway with the help of the DeForest County Sheriff's Office in Mississippi, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Alabama, the Columbia County Sheriff's Office in Florida, the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, the Kent County Prosecutor's Office, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Using IgG, they were able to check that the DNA of the perpetrator found in the Maryland case in 2006 and Sharon K. Hammock's case in 1996 was from the same person. IgG showed a family tree of that DNA sequence, which included Gary Dean Artman, and his previous record showed that he worked and lived in Michigan when Hammock was killed. Further investigations reveal that shortly before the homicide, the victim was in Ontario, California, and it was found that around the same time, Gary Dean Artman was within 20 miles of Ontario, California when he was cited by local authorities. All of these clues added up to the arrest of Gary Dean Artman after 26 years, who is now being held in the Forest County Sheriff's Office in Mississippi. The Kent County Sheriff's Office is trying to extradite Gary Dean Artman to Michigan, but the extradition is still in progress. The 26-year-old cold case is now finally solved with the help of technology and diligent police officers, who never gave up on cold cases by showing trust with the families that lost a loved one. On August 18, 2022, one of Sharon's case detectives knocked on Terry Nowitzka's, Sharon's sisters, door and Walker. The investigator wanted to make sure that the family learned of the arrest first. He had also gotten on the phone with one of Sharon's other sisters, Tina DeYoung. DeYoung was stunned. "It's just a flood of emotion," she told the police. "I'm happy, but I'm sad too." DeYoung said the news brought up the pain of losing her sister all over again, but she is grateful to the Kent County Sheriff's Department for never forgetting about her sister. Unfortunately, Sharon's parents, Jacob and Lois Gross, were both deceased before justice was served. "Mama, we got justice for her," DeYoung said Thursday night, looking up toward the sky. "I'm sorry it didn't happen before the good Lord took you, but justice will be served. You can celebrate with her up there." Police had been working on an in-depth examination of the 1990 murders and spoke with Terry Nowitzka's in mid-May. "We would love to know who did this to her. It wasn't right for any of the girls to have done this to them. Just terrible," Terry said tearfully. "Sharon was a loving sister, a loving daughter, and a loving mother to 2 children, and we miss her so badly. She was a loving sister, a loving daughter, and a loving mother." Terry said her sister was 3 to 4 months pregnant when she was killed. "So there's a baby we don't even know about," she said. "Sharon wanted everything out of life for her children. I don't know who she got hooked up with on drugs. When she first got into it, she wanted to get clean for her children, but then she got so far into crack that it took her downhill. It was just terrible to see her on the streets. I hated seeing her there." Finally, Sharon's family could now feel peace after the murderer was brought to justice. And indeed, Sharon Hammock was not the only sex worker to have gone missing and eventually been found dead in Michigan during the 1990s. Incredibly, she was the 9th of 12 killed during that decade in the Grand Rapids area. According to WID TV, the majority had addiction issues and were engaging in sex work as a result, which was more likely to put them in harm's way with a dangerous predator on the loose. By the time they were discovered, most of the bodies were skeletal, which led to issues collecting forensic evidence. The first was 25-year-old Lisa Ottberg, who was discovered in 1994, while the final victim, known as 29-year-old Victoria Moore, in 1996. The LA Times reported in 1996 that a task force had been set up that involved officers from around the region meeting in the basement of the Grand Rapids Police Department to investigate the murders. They believed that most had been targeted as they worked the so-called Sin Strip in Grand Rapids, a north-south artery that incorporated the red light district at the time, while many also had links to a women's refuge called Rose Haven. Director of the organization, Brenda Delecky, told the newspaper at the time, "Someone has a hook out there that is drawing just about anyone in. I'd be really surprised if it wasn't a serial killer. It's too much to be a coincidence." Task Force spokeswoman, Lieutenant Carol Price, commented in response, "We're not denying that it's a possibility, but we don't concentrate on that theory to the exclusion of others. There were never charges in any of the cases, but investigators are now looking into the possibility that Artman might have killed not just Sharon, but also the other sex workers in Grand Rapids, and that he committed similar crimes in other states like Maryland too. If he did use his transient lifestyle as a trucker to abduct and murder vulnerable women, It might be that many more families left wondering what happened to their loved ones are about to get the answers they have been seeking for so long. However, we must not forget to mention the technologies used to capture Gary Dean Artman. This case shows that no matter how anyone tries to escape the consequences of his or her actions, they will come back full circle. Could this be called karma? What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Peterborough is a well-known cathedral city with a Gothic facade located in Cambridgeshire. England, sitting on the banks of the Neme River, this city has a rich history that goes back to the 13th century. This is where this sad tale took place. Ricky Lee Harvey was born March 4th, 1988 in Peterborough, England, to parents Trevor Harvey and Ruth Neve. The couple separated when Ricky was just 3 years old. Trevor had very little involvement in his child's life after the divorce. Ruth went on to marry a man named Dean Neve, who then officially adopted Ricky, thus changing his name to Ricky Neve. However, the marriage was not smooth and Dean rarely stayed at home. In 1994, 6-year-old Ricky was living with his mother and 2 younger sisters, Rochelle and Sheridan. By many accounts, the home was unfit for young children. Allegedly, Ruth was extremely abusive towards her children, which included physical beatings and starvation. Social services were regular visitors to that home and previously placed Ricky's 8-year-old big sister Rebecca up for adoption. Ricky was also put on the at-risk register, but was, for some reason, allowed to stay with his mother. Ruth herself grew up in an abusive home and then in foster care for most of her childhood. At a very young age, she developed an addiction to drugs which continued on for most of her adult life. Although Ruth blamed Ricky for her husband's absence and punished him harshly on many occasions, Ricky never lost his caring side. He would bathe, feed, and take care of his younger sisters when their mother neglected them. Despite all of the hardships, Ricky was growing up to be a bright, emphatic, and caring person. That is, until his life was tragically cut short at the tender age of 6. On November 28, 1994, around 9:30 a.m., he left his home on the Welland estate in Peterborough and headed for school. He was never seen alive again. When the young boy failed to return home from school that fateful day, Ruth called 999 around 6 p.m. to report her son missing. Sadly, the next day, Ricky's nude body was discovered in a wooded area on the fringe of the estate, just 5 minutes away from his home. It was a place where he often came to play with his friends. His body was posed in the shape of a star. He was laying on his back and his arms were outstretched and his legs were spread wide. The position of his limbs were eerily symmetrical, leading investigators to believe it was some kind of a sacrifice or ritual killing. There was no sign of his clothing, but a single small white shirt button was laying just 18 inches away from his left hand. Ligature marks on the front of his neck were seemingly caused by the zipper on his coat, which indicated that the attack was most likely launched from behind, and the weapon had been his own coat. The post-mortem report of Ricky showed he was indeed strangled to death. November 29, 1994, Ricky's clothes were found in a trash bin, 150 yards from the murder scene. There, police would find his school uniform, which included a white shirt, a blue coat, and gray trousers. 3 top buttons from the shirt were missing. His black school shoes were also there with their laces still tied. The mud on his shoes indicated that he had walked into the woods and never came out again. In the right-hand pocket of the jacket were 2 small plastic toys and some cards. With her prolonged history of abuse, Ruth stood out as a prime suspect in her son's murder investigation. Although no physical evidence that connected Ruth to the crime was discovered at the crime scene, authorities found some questionable items in the house. They found several books on the occult, magic, and even devil worship. Additionally, they found a book containing a picture of the famous drawing of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. Investigators at the time believed that in one of its forms, the posture in the picture resembled the pose in which Ricky's naked body was found. They speculated that Ruth had probably killed her son as a sacrifice to win back her husband, without any other suspects in sight. In 1995, police arrested Ruth on suspicion of killing her own son. Ruth repeatedly denied the accusations, but nobody paid heed to her words. On January 9, 1995, Ruth was arrested on the charge of killing her own 6-year-old son. Her trial began in October 1996. This case garnered massive attention from the media in the UK. After all, it was a heinous crime allegedly committed by a mother upon her own flesh and blood. The ultimate sin that a mother can commit. Media had already branded her as evil, and it was obvious whom the public considered responsible for the murder, and they were desperate to see her punished. Still, there was no physical evidence that put her at the scene of the crime. Despite this, the prosecution tried to show her as an abusive mother who sacrificed her son to fulfill her sick desires. The defense tried their best to focus on the physical evidence. During the trial, police officer Robert McNeil testified that on the day Ricky was reported missing, he searched the area but did not find Ricky's body. He believed Ricky was killed in another location and later moved to where his body was eventually found. This meant that Ruth would have been with the police when the moving of the body had to have occurred. The judge told the jury that if they believed the officer, they had to believe Ruth was innocent because the timeline did not add up if the two theories were combined. After hearing all the evidence, a jury at Northampton Crown Court acquitted Ruth Meave of murdering her son, Ricky. She did, however, plead guilty to child cruelty charges and was sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment. She was released from prison in 2000. From the start, she has always maintained that she was coerced into pleading guilty. Whatever the truth was, as time passed, without any leads to chase, Ricky Neave's murder case would lay dormant for years. After being released from prison, Ruth moved to Cambridgeshire. There she met a man named Gary Roger, whom she later married. Her 2 younger children were taken from her custody after her conviction and later adopted by 2 separate families. They had little to no contact with Ruth afterward. In 2014, Ruth started campaigning to reopen the case and urged authorities to find her son's killer. Eventually, detectives decided to review the case, which has been regarded as one of the most high-profile cold cases in the UK. Was determined to review all the evidence available from the original investigation in the hopes of finding new clues considering new enhanced forensic developments. Detectives found that the trash bin where Ricky's clothes were discovered had never been tested for additional evidence and was not even preserved for later use. However, DNA samples were collected from items of clothing in 1994, but the technology was not sufficiently advanced to provide a DNA match. That DNA was sent to the forensic lab to be reanalyzed using modern techniques. When the results came back, there was a match. They finally had a new suspect, James Watson. The DNA was present in the database because of an arson attack at a British transport police station in 2008. In fact, he was a serial offender who often committed crimes for the thrill of it. Unbelievably, James Watson had been questioned during the initial investigation as a witness after another eyewitness gave information about seeing Watson with Ricky. During questioning, the then 13-year-old Watson stated that on the day that Ricky went missing, he saw Ricky around the middle of the day. He claimed that he had skipped school that day to visit his father, and despite not knowing Ricky, he had a brief exchange with him when little Ricky made the offhanded comment, "That's a big tractor, isn't it?" To which Watson replied, "That's not a tractor, that's a digger." However, he claimed to have never seen the boy again. Notably, in this whole ordeal, he never mentioned having physical contact with the 6-year-old schoolboy on the day of his disappearance. James Watson was born on April 1, 1981 in Welland Estate, England. Due to his unstable home condition, he was sent to a children's home early on in life. His father, James Watson Sr., was arrested and imprisoned for some unspecified charges. Watson never got along with his father anyway. Due to the constant abuse he received from him, he was doing well in the care of his foster mother until she got scared after seeing a shotgun in his hand, realizing that Watson was too much to handle. She arranged to send him away to Woodgate's Children's Home, just 20 miles from Peterborough. By 1993, the social services regarded him as a vulnerable child. That same year, he was accused of touching a 5-year-old boy inappropriately, but denied the allegations and no further action was taken. In 1994, 13-year-old Watson was still living in Woodgate Children's Home, near Ricky's house. In the coming years, He would rack up a lengthy list of strange behaviors and run-ins with authorities throughout his childhood and into adulthood. By the age of 13, he fantasized about strangling a kid, and even told his mother he had heard a news report on the radio about a boy being found strangled. This was just a few days prior to Ricky's murder. His mother simply said she hadn't heard about it and dismissed the incident. In January 1995, while at the children's home, Watson stole track signal detonators that give off a loud noise and laid them on a railway line. Watson later explained how much fun he had doing it, and he delighted in the notoriety. In August 2005, he stole police uniforms, important police equipment, and car keys from a police station and left them in a car. While asked to explain the reasoning, he said that a majority of his crimes had been to get arrested when his life was not going as planned. Then, for years later in January 2009, Watson again broke into a British transport police station and stole some items. He then set fire to the property store before absconding on a bicycle. Over the years, Watson had been responsible for countless burglaries, theft, and other criminal activities. But the string of offenses doesn't just end with stealing, burglarizing, or even arson attacks. Deep inside, Watson possessed sick sexual desires, which would showcase their symptoms from an early age. Watson's former girlfriend met him when he was just 15. Despite Watson identifying as gay, he formed a relationship with her. She described her horrible experience with him, saying that he used to bring a survival kit, which included a knife, when they went into the woods for sex. She added that towards the end, he would firmly hold her neck and try to choke her during intercourse, leaving marks on her throat. He became more and more forceful as time went on, almost reaching the point of strangulation. The manager of the children's home, where Watson was living between 1994 and 1995, found catalog magazines under his bed that had pictures of babies and toddlers, mostly wearing underwear. He also possessed an unhealthy interest in animals, which often resulted in the death of poor creatures. Despite having such a troublesome past, in all those years, authorities never set their focus on James Watson as a possible suspect for Ricky's murder until DNA evidence pointed to him. When detectives confronted Watson about the DNA on Ricky's clothes, he tried to explain the situation, saying he had picked Ricky up to help him see over a wooden fence at some diggers on a construction site, a detail that he conveniently forgot to mention in his original statement in 1994. However, investigators found that the fence was built years later and had not been there during the time of Ricky Neve's murder, further implicating Watson with his own lies. Although this is the evidence that, along with DNA, ultimately sealed his fate. Investigators started putting other pieces together in order to build a strong case. They found that after Ricky's murder, Watson kept newspaper clippings about the case and made numerous copies of them, probably fascinated and excited by his own actions. In April 2016, James Watson was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was later released on police bail and was sent to a bail hostel, which is an approved premises run by probation or volunteer services. He left the UK with a bail hostel companion to escape justice. He first traveled to Rotterdam, then France, and over the Pyrenees to Portugal. During this time, there are multiple pictures of him lounging on the beach, seemingly without a care in the world. From France, he contacted his sister, Claire Perna, who contacted the authorities. Eventually, he was arrested near the British Embassy in Lisbon. His trial began in January 2022 and lasted 11 weeks. During the trial, a heap of evidence was presented to the jury. The DNA evidence, his constant lies, the copied newspaper clippings, mud on the shoe, all pointing towards Watson. It was also argued by the prosecution that undigested food in Ricky's stomach suggested that he had been murdered within 2 hours of leaving home, around the time when the witness had seen Watson with Ricky. Finally, the jury found James Watson guilty on the murder of Ricky Neve, ending a 27-year mystery after 36 hours of deliberation. In late June 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years. The sentence reflected the fact that he was only 13 years of age when he committed the heinous crime. Ricky's mom Ruth has branded him pure evil, describing how the young boy's murder tore her family apart. Ricky's sister Rochelle said that the verdict was a victory and justice had finally been served after years. She was the one who successfully challenged the decision when prosecutors felt there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. She was part of a victim's right to review to get the decision reversed. Although in the end justice was served, the case is tragic in so many ways. A sweet young boy with a cheeky smile was brutally murdered by another child after suffering years of abuse at the hands of his own mother. The social services failed both boys. Everyone failed them. We can only find solace in the fact that James Watson will no longer be able to hurt anyone else. Our story unfolds in Brighton, New York, a charming suburban town nestled in Monroe County, near the southeastern border of Rochester. In 1952, Kathleen Schlosser entered the world into a blue-collar family in Mount Clemens, Michigan. Known as Kathy, she grew up amidst 6 siblings, characterized as a lively and affable blonde who was popular at her Michigan high school. It was there that she crossed paths with a boy who would profoundly impact her life. James Krausneck, a reserved, amiable, and athletic lad from a prominent local family, was just a year older. However, their romance didn't blossom until they both attended Western Michigan University. Despite their differing personalities and family backgrounds, love bloomed between them. They tied the knot in May 1974 in a church in Mount Clemens. By 1975, armed with Kathy's bachelor's degree and James's master's, the couple embarked on a new chapter, relocating to Fort Collins, Colorado. There, James would begin studying for his PhD at Colorado State. Although Kathy suffered a miscarriage, shortly after moving, she would give birth to the couple's only child, Sarah, a few years later. Jim finished his doctoral dissertation and began teaching at Lynchburg College in Virginia. He was known as Dr. Krausneck at Lynchburg, although he had never actually received his doctoral degree. His dissertation had been returned for revisions and Jim never bothered to resubmit his work. Kathy urged him to find a more lucrative line of work in order to provide a better lifestyle for the family, yet he was very reluctant to do so, most likely because he knew he didn't have the credentials needed. Desperate, he pressed for a salary increase, but his request was denied. Finally, he accepted the role of economist at Kodak and became part of the Kodak family in Kodak's heyday when it employed about 60,000 people. With the new high-paying job and some financial help from James' parents, the Krausnecks bought a new home on Del Rio Drive in the Rochester suburb of Brighton, New York, near the Kodak headquarters. After moving to the new house, Kathy enrolled Sarah in Queen of Peace Nursery School near their home and made a few friends there. She also enrolled Sarah in dance class. Although Kathy felt somewhat isolated at home during James' long work hours and Sarah's classes, she never complained. By early 1982, they had all the makings of the American dream. An adorable 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, a well-maintained house in the suburbs, and James' new high-paying job as an economist at Eastman Kodak. Nonetheless, trouble was still looming over their heads. Kodak officials were skeptical about James's PhD, as he delayed providing evidence of the degree he received. This, combined with other work pressure, made him distant from home. Kathy told friends that he would often come home from work angry and short-tempered. The couple had been having troubles for some time. Kathy was reportedly distraught because he lied about finishing his PhD. This had been the cause of much of the turmoil in their relationship. She had even discussed taking Sarah and going back to their hometown. However, no domestic violence was ever reported. Sadly, tragedy would soon strike the Krausneck family. On the morning of February 19, 1982, just 6 months after moving into the new house, officers of the Brighton Police Department responded to a 911 call made. James Krausneck came back home from his work to find his 29-year-old wife, Kathy's lifeless body huddled in bed in a bedroom upstairs while their 3.5-year-old daughter, Sarah, stared out of the window. After entering the house, the officers stepped into a gruesome crime scene in the master bedroom. Kathy was lying in a pool of blood in her own bed with a long-handled axe embedded in her skull. The murder weapon was taken from the couple's garage, which was unlocked. Sarah was home with her mother all day, but wasn't harmed in any way. When police questioned James about his whereabouts that day, he explained that his wife and daughter were sleeping peacefully when he left for work at around 6:30 a.m. that morning. He stated that he returned home at 5 p.m. Upon discovering his wife's body, he claimed he grabbed his daughter and got out of the house, running to a neighbor's house to call for help. When young Sarah was questioned, she said she saw a bad man, but her father refused to let her talk to the investigators any further. Not many clues were left of the crime scene. There were signs of a burglary, but the investigators felt that there was something off about the scene. A window was discovered broken. Some silver and jewelry were neatly arranged both upstairs and downstairs, as if left behind by the burglar. On the dining room floor, 2 candelabra and a silver tea set had been placed upright near a plastic bag. A screwdriver was found lying on the stairs. Kathy's purse lay in the dining room with the contents scattered. The family dog had been locked away in the basement of the home. Interestingly, no items were stolen from the house, leading the investigators to believe that the burglary was staged. The medical examiner ruled that Kathy died from a single axe blow to the head and the brain while Kathy had been asleep. The handle of the axe had been wiped clean. The time of death was believed to be between 6:55 a.m. and 8:55 a.m., which ruled out Kathy's husband James as a suspect. This case became known in the media as the Brighton Axe murder. In the initial investigation, one suspect considered by investigators was the convicted killer and sex offender Ed Larrabee, who lived near the couple's home at the time. In fact, in 2014, when he was in prison for an unrelated murder, Larrabee confessed to killing Kathy Krausnick. However, the details he shared weren't consistent with the evidence. He said the murder occurred during the summer of 1981, when in reality, it was the winter of 1982. Apparently, Larrabee was a reputed serial confessor who falsely confessed to several crimes that he did not commit in order to gain notoriety. Some of the supposed victims he had claimed to have murdered were in fact still alive. Investigators were short of physical or circumstantial evidence to link anyone to the crime. Despite tireless efforts from the investigators, the Brighton Axe murder remained unsolved for many years. Just a day after Kathy's passing, James went back to MT Clemens with Sarah without even informing Sarah's family. Sarah would not have any contact with her maternal family in the following years. 4 years after the gruesome murder in 1986, James remarried. However, it only lasted 9 months. Although James claimed that he had remarried in order for Sarah to have a mother, his second wife believed that James had ended the marriage after he felt a close bond developing between his new wife and Sarah. As the 1990s progressed, James remarried twice after he had moved to Washington. He joined a subsidiary of Weyerhaeuser. He climbed the corporate ladder and worked in California and Georgia before he was promoted to vice president of sales at the company's headquarters in Washington. Even though James had an early divorce from his third wife, he and his fourth wife, Sharon, seemed to have a good marriage and led a luxurious life. They bought a 4-bedroom French country house in Gig Harbor near Tacoma. Meanwhile, Sarah moved to Texas and started her own family. She was always in close contact with her father and stepmother. As years passed, not much progress was made in the case until District Attorney Sandra Dorley and her team started taking a closer look in 2015. They began rummaging for evidence that might have been missed previously. Amongst the evidence was a thin, blue fiber made of glass that came from a shattered window of the house. Dorley tried to match it to a previously untested blue knee sock found in the house. After extensive testing yielded no DNA from a source outside of the home, the idea of an outside killer was pretty much blown out of the water. Sandra and her team zeroed in on one possible suspect, Kathy's husband, James. Yet they could not just charge him based on circumstantial evidence. And there was one more problem. The time of Kathy's death put him outside of his house at the time of the murder, and therefore ruled him out as a suspect. Dorley and her team weren't ready to let him off the hook that easily. They then contacted renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, who has previously been integral in many high-profile cases. After studying all of the pertinent documents from the case, including police reports, autopsy reports, photographs, and other evidence, Baden concluded that Kathy died before James left for work that morning. He explained that, contrary to what the original medical examiner had reported, He believed the time of death to have been earlier, due to partially digested food in her stomach and the stage of rigor mortis that her body was in. The original examiner had observed rigor mortis to have set in the evening of the crime. Baden stated that it takes a minimum of 12 hours for a body to reach the level of rigor mortis observed. Hence, he opined that the murder must have occurred between 9 p.m. the previous evening and 3 or 4 a.m. on the morning of the crime. In 2019, based on Dr. Baden's analysis, along with their other evidence, James Krausneck was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. His trial began in August 2022. The defense tried to point out that all the evidence was circumstantial and that Kathy could have been a victim of Larrabee, who had already passed away. The prosecutors argued that there was no evidence of an intruder. The robbery was staged and James was the only person who could have killed his wife, considering their young daughter was unharmed despite being present at the scene. The jury sided with the prosecution. James Krausneck, who was now 70 years old, was convicted of second-degree murder for the death of his wife, Kathy, in 1982. 41-year-old Sarah, however, stood by her father and did not believe her father had anything to do with her mother's murder. On the other hand, after 40 years of mourning, Kathy's family feels relieved to see that justice has been served. Kathy Krausneck's sister, Annette Schlosser, when asked about how the last 40 years have gone, told Spectrum News that their mother had died without knowing who her daughter's killer was. Annette was quoted saying, "We were living in hell." And she believed that because who could do that to her daughter? Kathy's 95-year-old father, however, was present in the court to witness James being held accountable for his daughter's horrific murder. The only thing the Schlosser family now wants is to reunite with Kathy's daughter, as they have had no contact with her in years. They stated, "We hope they can heal together from this tragic incident." James Krausneck will be sentenced on November 7th in front of New York State Supreme Court Justice Charles Ciano. Do you trust Dr. Baden's conclusion, or is it all just circumstantial evidence? What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Our story takes us to the beautiful and peaceful village called Rouchac. Rouchac is a village and civil parish in the Wyre Forest district of Worcestershire, England. This is where Brenda lived before she met and married David Venables. Apart from a light industrial estate, Rouchac has 58 residential properties and a population of only about 124 people. The church stands on top of a bank and has a panoramic view. Nothing much ever happened here. Kempsey is a village and civil parish in the Malvern Hills district in the county of Worcestershire. Bounded by the River Severn to the west and with the A38 main road running through it, it is about 3 miles south of Worcester. The village has a long history and its name is derived from the Saxon Chemys I, or the island of Chemys. Chemys was a Saxon chief whose island lay between the marshes and the River Severn. One of the roads in Kempsey, Leaf's Lane, is named after another Saxon chief, and this is where Brenda and David started their married life. Kempsey was a calm area, consisting mainly of agricultural lands. No one would ever believe that anything violent would take place here, which makes it all the more surprising as to what happened. Brenda Bolton was 23 when she met David, who would later become her husband at a young. Both came from rural communities and farming families, so they connected straight away. After that first meeting at Droitwich Winter Gardens, David made time to see her at home in the tiny village of Rouchac, while juggling working on his family's pig farm. He would stop in for breakfast at Brenda's house on his way home from trips, taking produce from the farm to the Birmingham wholesale market. They were married in June 1960, before a honeymoon in Jersey. The couple later moved together at Quaking House Farm in Kempsey with the financial help of David's father. There David farmed pigs and the pair enjoyed a magnificent view of the surrounding countryside. To outsiders, their life seemed simple yet idyllic. Everything seemed normal as time progressed, but eventually the fateful day arrived. On May 3, 1982, Brenda was nowhere to be found. David searched extensively throughout his home and the surrounding areas, but finally filed a missing person report the following day. The village of Kempsey was soon overrun as the search for Brenda got underway. West Mercia police used a helicopter to help aid with the search. Tracker dogs were used to check farm buildings and abandoned properties, but no trace of her was found. There was a lot of speculation and many things were put forward, but most of them turned out to be just rumors. A lot of people heard rumors that she might be under the M5 motorway, which was being built during her disappearance. The police search lasted 2 or 3 weeks, covering a 4 or 5 mile area around Kempsey, up to the M50 motorway, including David's own 9 acres of land. There was a great deal of police presence in the area, searching everywhere to see if there was anything that would lead to finding Brenda. They cut back all the growth in the ditches to see if there was anything in them, but no traces or evidence was found. After a while, with nothing being found, the case went cold due to no fresh leads for the police to follow. For almost 40 years, Brenda's family was left without a single answer about what happened to her. Vicki Jennings, a friend of the couple, later recounted David not being overly concerned and that he didn't appear to actively partake in the search for his wife. However, David claimed to have had sleepless nights after Brenda went missing. David also told the police that Brenda had been suffering from depression due to a recent bout of the flu. David moved out of his farm in 2014 into a more luxurious house. The new owners of his old property lived there happily until July 2019. Then one day, the new owners wanted their septic tank serviced and cleaned out. When the servicing began, it was a spine-chilling sight for everyone as they discovered a lump of hair, a human skull, a pelvis, and thigh bones. They also found remnants of clothing, including half a pair of knickers, tights, a bra, the remains of some shoes, and a sweater. At the time of the discovery, a search was ongoing just 7 miles away for a state agent, but police found no link between the remains and Ms. Lamplugh. It took over a year until detectives announced the bones had formerly been identified as those of Brenda's. David, who was then 88, was charged with the murder of Brenda. The police searched for hours in the garden and the garage. Although the owner moved in recently, he had a lot of stuff with him due to the massive size of the property. Many of the neighbors recall that the missing Brenda Venables case was the most discussed in their village many years ago. The neighbors always perceived David as the non-interactive quiet man, but no one expected his silence to hold the details of a gruesome murder. During David's trial, details of his double life were revealed. Investigators discovered that he had been in a long-term on-off relationship with Lorraine, who was his mother's nurse. During the investigation after Brenda's disappearance, 1984 Lorraine Stiles gave a few statements about David. In those she said, "He seemed quite composed and suddenly told me his wife had disappeared the night before." Lorraine claimed to be shocked at how calm he was when Brenda disappeared. During police interrogations, David tried to prove his innocence by claiming Fred West, a serial killer, could have been responsible for killing his spouse. But the possibility of Fred killing Brenda and putting her in a septic tank on her own property seemed too unrealistic to the authorities. David's lawyers tried to defend him by claiming that it would be absolute madness for him to have hidden his wife's body so close to their marital home. Although the prosecutors claimed Mr. David as the murderer, defense barrister Timothy Honham questioned why David would sell his property if he knew his wife's body was in the septic tank. Timothy Hannum also stated David got his septic tank cleaned on more than one occasion. Timothy asked for a fair verdict of not guilty, suggesting that there was not sufficient evidence to convict David, but only assumptions mixed with guesswork and speculation. He also said the possibility of suicide should also be taken into consideration as the septic tank was the closest to Brenda's house. But there was one major flaw with that claim, as the lid of the septic tank was perfectly concealed, and it was highly unlikely for a suicidal person to put the top back on before dying. David then claimed to have loved his wife Brenda very much, citing how active they were sexually. David even claimed the couple had intimate relations the night before her disappearance. But the court had other evidence, and they pulled up Brenda's psychiatric consultant's reports, which claimed that the couple had not slept together since 1968 and had not shared a bed for 3 years. Considering all these contradictions, the court convicted David of the murder of Brenda. A final plea was made by David's defendants to reduce his sentence, as he was already 88 years old, but the prosecutor rejected the appeal, stating concerns. Prosecutor Michael Burrows, QC, told jurors David wanted Brenda out of the way as he wanted to resume his long-standing affair with another woman. He also said David knew the septic tank was in a secluded location. It was for him almost the perfect hiding place. And for nearly 40 years it was as he got away with murder. The family members of Brenda Venables released a statement to the press. The statement said, "We, Brenda's nieces and nephews, are relieved that today, after a wait of 37 years, at last there is justice for Brenda. David Venables can no longer get away with having murdered his wife, the hiding of her body and all of his deceit, lies and fabrications." The victim in this case was around the same age as the case itself when it was solved. Judith Conklin was born in 1938 in North Hollywood, California. Judy, as most people called her, met Fred Nesbitt on a blind date. Fred in those days worked as a lifeguard at Newport Beach, and Judy was a bright student who belonged to a tight-knit North Hollywood family. It was love at first sight which led to the death of Judy. A marriage a year later. Fred and Judy would go on to have 4 kids together. They weren't wealthy, but they were happy. In 1972, the family relocated to Irvine, California, where Fred landed a job at the Paul Monroe Hydraulics of Whittier. He quickly climbed the ranks and was eventually promoted to vice president of sales. Judy decided to stay home with the kids. She dedicated her life to the family. The family was very close. Their weekends were filled with an active outdoor life, most of which they spent on their yacht, called Felicidad IV, a 36-foot-long cabin cruiser. This was their home away from home. The family had the boat for a long time. They recall cruising the ocean with the children on deck. Is a Spanish word that translates to happiness, but tragically that is where their happiness was stripped away. November 26, 1980. It was 9:30 in the morning when the phone rang. As Judy's son recalls, the Nesbitts had recently posted an ad in the local newspaper. They had decided to sell their yacht. There was a potential buyer on the other end of the line who wanted to come over and take a look at the boat. They set up a meeting at the Marina Dunes Yacht Anchorage in Newport Beach later in the afternoon. Judy left the house at around 12:30 to meet the potential buyer at 1 p.m. That was the last time she was seen alive. The children were home, enjoying the Thanksgiving break. As the sun began setting, their oldest was by now a bit worried. It was 7 p.m. when Fred made it back home. By then, Judy had been gone for more than 6 hours. He knew it wasn't like her to be gone for so long. Worried, he headed down to the marina to look for her. Fred thought maybe Judy might have stopped somewhere to pick up a few things, or maybe she wanted to spend some time on the boat before they sold it. Felicidad IV did pack a lot of memories for the family, and letting it go must have been hard for her. Fred walked down to the boat, but the door was locked. Fred unlocked the door and entered. He then headed towards the front of the boat. He found her there in the sleeping quarters, but to his horror, she was sprawled on the floor covered in blood. She was motionless and unresponsive. Fred frantically tried to feel for her pulse. His own pulse was racing. He could not tell if it was already too late or if she still had a chance. He screamed at the top of his lungs, and thankfully someone heard him. They called an ambulance, but it was in fact too late. The post-mortem report said that she had been violently attacked. There were signs that she was struck in the head 3 times with a heavy blunt object. There were signs of a struggle. As the detectives visualized the events, it was apparent that Judy had fought for her life, but her efforts to get away from her attacker were thwarted when he pulled out a small caliber gun and shot her in the head point blank. The only things that were missing were Judy's credit cards, checkbook, and some cash. The yacht was not looted, possibly because the attacker needed to flee quickly after the murder. Judy had no signs of sexual assault. Deal gone wrong. That seemed to be the most plausible scenario. Presumably there had been some sort of argument about the selling of the yacht which triggered the assault and subsequent murder. They started questioning residents and people who were present in the area during the time of the attack. The suspect wasn't exactly as covert as he should have been. Police were able to get a detailed sketch of the murderer from eyewitnesses. A woman who owned a boat docked near Felicidad IV. She claimed to have seen the man up close. That day she had called in a maintenance worker at noon to work on her boat. She mistook the suspect for the serviceman and talked to him for a while, inquiring if he was the man appointed to service her boat. The man said no as he waited for Judy at Newport Beach. She even saw Judy walk over to him and then walk to the boat together. As she even heard someone screaming, but she didn't think too much about it until she heard the screaming again, followed by a loud sound which sounded like a gunshot. She wasn't the only one who heard it. There were many people in the area that day, and the bay was filled with yachts. There was no way to know where the screams came from. No one alerted the police, and no one suspected that what they heard was someone being murdered. Ruth spotted the suspect walking towards the parking lot, and then, shortly after, returning to Felicidad 4. He was calm and nonchalant enough not to raise any concerns. He left shortly after. Everyone knew that had to have been the man who killed Judy. Police took Ruth in to help create a sketch of the suspect. He was described as a white man in his mid-30s with a medium build. He was wearing a pair of aviator sunglasses, a tan jacket and brown trousers. He was well-groomed with neat short hair. Unfortunately, it was a description that matched a lot of people in the area. Many people submitted tips based on the sketch, but none turned out to be fruitful. Police had gathered evidence and fingerprints from the crime scene, but unfortunately that would not be very useful either. The Nesbitt family had hosted a party on the yacht shortly before the incident, so there were several sets of fingerprints on the boat. The main evidence they had was an unidentified brown hair. Police went on to investigate Judy's background and questioned Fred's colleagues. Everything checked out, and the Nesbitts had maintained a good reputation in the neighborhood and had no enemies. Police continued flipping through the case files to see if there were any similar incidents. They zeroed in on a so-called wanted rapist who had been notorious in the San Francisco area. There were about 6 cases that were almost identical to this one. A man had raped women after making appointments with them to show him boats for sale, but none of them were killed, and of course Judy had not been raped. This lead seemed to be promising, yet when he was called in for questioning, he had an airtight alibi proving that he was nowhere. Near Newport Beach, when the crime took place, he was ruled out as a suspect. The case was going nowhere, and all leads led to dead ends. With more than 200 cases of unsolved murders in Orange County, the Judy Nesbitt case was just one of many. Yet, the police never gave up, nor did the Nesbitt family. In 2002, investigators obtained DNA from the root of the hair. This was entered into the FBI database, but unfortunately, the DNA didn't match anyone. Yet again, they read a dead end. The evidence was locked up and assigned a case number among many others. 16 years later, in 2018, the DNA was sent out for processing again, this time using brand new techniques and technology. Green Laboratories began processing the DNA using a new extraction technique to expand the DNA profile. This case would go down in history as the first case that used this technology to identify a murderer in the United States. There was a match. The Newport police finally closed the case after 41 years on the 9th of August, 2021. They had the name of the man who had evaded justice for 38 years. They eventually identified the murderer as Kenneth Elwin Marks through genetic genealogy. The man who responded to the ad and the man who Ruth Mills mistook for a serviceman 4 decades ago. Unfortunately, they were 22 years late. In April 1999, Kenneth Elwin Marks passed away after a long battle with cancer. He was seemingly a normal guy according to those who knew him. No one would have thought that this man would have been involved in the gruesome murder of Judy 19 years earlier. He was only 44 years old when he was buried at the Thomas Cemetery in Bridgeport, Texas. We will never know what really happened that day, or why anyone would take the life of a mother and wife. Just before Thanksgiving, a holiday that symbolizes family togetherness. Judy Nesbitt was a loving wife and mother who was violently and senselessly ripped from her family. Identifying her killer was all the more bittersweet after learning he would never face justice, at least not here on Earth. Newport Beach Police Chief John T. Lewis was quoted as saying, "And the Nesbitt family." He added, "Kenneth Marks has passed away, but he no longer gets to hold the secret of his deeds." Through incredible advances in technology and the tireless dedication of these investigators, we now have some closure for all who knew and loved Judy Nesbitt. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.